In this exercise, we're going to practice some pose-to-pose and frame-by-frame animation by doing a simple ball bouncing animation that ends in a splat. So let's get started. To get started on this exercise, you should have downloaded the Room Background JPEG. We're going to use this as the background for our bouncing ball composition. Let's jump into Adobe After Effects and create a new composition. The size is going to be 1920 by 1080 pixels with a frame rate of 24 frames per second and a duration lasting 6 seconds. Everything else will be exactly the same. We'll say OK to this. Let's go up to File and down to Import. Let's import that background Room JPEG. From here, we can simply drag it into our layers composition and lock down the layer so we don't accidentally move it. Now let's use a vector shape to create a simple ball in the middle. Before I do this, make sure in your preferences under General Settings that you have Center Anchor Point in New Layer Shapes checked on. This will automatically put your central point in the middle of your shape. I'm going to use my Ellipse tool, set my fill color to be just a solid red, and my stroke color will be set to none. I'm going to click and drag. Hold down your Shift key to get a perfect circle, and we'll make something that's about this size. The size doesn't have to be 100% perfect. Now, as we bounce the ball, we're going to be stretching it out and squashing it and returning it back up here. By default, we do have our central point in the center of our ball, but we want to move it down to this bottom center so that it'll make it easier to squash and stretch and act naturally. To move that point, choose your Pan Behind or Anchor Point tool. With this tool, this will allow you to click on the anchor point and simply drag it to a new position. I'm going to put it right here at the bottom center point. Let's also return down to our timeline, and we'll close the contents for now, but twirl open the transform, set your playhead to 0 seconds, and let's check on the position and the scale keyframe timing. So this will be the starting point for our ball. Notice that it's going to start at the top position, fall down, we're going to squash and stretch it when it strikes, and then have it bounce up and return to this position. To bring it down, let's move our playhead to ½ second, so 12 frames, and we'll say in 12 frames it's going to go from the top all the way down to striking right about here on the central point. As it falls, let's also stretch this out. Going down to our timeline, make sure the scale is unlinked so that you can have two different numbers for both your height and your width. Let's set the width to be 70 and the height, since we're bringing it in by 30, to be 130 to go up to height. Notice now this will stretch it out. To test it, you can see as it falls, it stretches out until it hits the ground. Now I'm going to move over just 2 frames by holding the Command key and using my arrows to go over to frame number 14, and let's have it hit the ground and squash, stretch out. So to do this, all we're going to do is adjust the scale, setting this time to be 130 and this one to be 70. Now that it's completely down, all we need to do is reverse our animation and have it go back up. We can do this easily by copying and pasting our frames. Let's do this first one set right here, which is actually, the second set. So this is the point at which it's stretching all the way down. So with those 2 selected, we'll do Command C to copy it. Since this point was at frame number 14, let's go over 2 more frames to frame 16 and do Command V to paste it. You can see now how that stretches it back up. Finally, let's choose our beginning points for it to return to. With those selected, Command C to copy it, and then we can move over 12 more frames to frame 1 second and 3 frames right here, and Command V to paste those, and that will return it back up. Let's test our animation. So far that's looking really good. It goes down, it squashes really quickly, and then bounces back up. Now let's see if we can make our ball fall and return back to its position in a little bit more natural state. We can do this by adding some easing in and easing out. In order to do this, with nothing selected, I'm going to click on my graph editor. Notice that when you go into graph editor mode with nothing selected, you don't see a graph. Now we want to be able to show any selected properties, so make sure that's turned on under your eyeball. And also, we're only going to affect the speed graph. Also, I make sure auto zoom graph is turned on, and later on I'm going to fit the graph so I can see it a little bit better. When you click on the word position, this is going to load up the graph editor just for the position keyframes. Now I'm going to click on the scale the graph to fit it to my view so I can see everything. What we want to do is to affect this first keyframe. So carefully select the first keyframe, and when we drag it down to the 0 position, notice that it's going to start to add an ease out effect. Let's click on its Bezier handle and drag it over to really emphasize and make it much more dramatic. So if we were to test it, you can see how it falls much more naturally, and it feels like it's really being pulled down. So if that happens for this side, let's do the same for this one. We're going to select this last keyframe and drop it down to 0. We want it to start very quickly, so I'm going to drag its Bezier handle this way to match the curve on the other side. And if it's off by a little bit, that's okay. Now to test it, you can see now how it falls and comes back up perfectly. Go into our graph editor, we can turn it off, and I'm going to scale in so I can see everything. Let's test it one more time. Now it's falling and working really nicely. Now that we've got one bounce done, to add a second bounce, all we have to do is copy and paste our keyframes. We've already got one set of keyframes established for its starting position here. So all I'm going to do is select the down and return keyframes. So all of these, Command C to copy. We're going to move forward 12 frames, the same amount of distance here. So 12 plus 3 is 15, so 1 second and 15. And then we'll do Command V to paste it. To test our animation, you can see it's doing pretty good except for that second fall. The reason the second fall is happening can be found in our graph editor. Let's open this up again. Again, go to your graph editor, select position. You can see that when it falls and goes back up, we need to have a curve for this area. This area is going down simply straight. In other words, it's not easing in as it falls in for this one. So I'm going to select this keyframe, drag it downward, and then bring this back up so that now it has 2 looping arcs. To test it again, bounce, bounce. Perfect. Let's turn off our graph editor and bring it back to here. Now from this point, we're going to swap modes in how we edit the ball. Instead of editing the position and the scale for it to fall and to splat out, we need to be able to edit the path of our selected ball. To do this, we need to make a copy of our ball. And we need to have this copy start at exactly the same time that this ball ends on our timeline. This can be easily done. I'm going to go down to my timeline and simply close it up. With Shape Layer 1 selected, go up to Edit and choose Split Layer. Notice the keyboard shortcut is Shift-Command-D. Whenever you split a layer, notice that it'll make a copy of the layer, and if you check out your timeline, the original layer is going to end at this point, and the new layer is automatically going to start at this point. And this is what we want. We can also go into our Shape Layer 2, open up the Transform, and safely uncheck the stopwatch for both position and scale. We're not going to be doing any transformations. Instead, we can open up the contents for Ellipse 1, and you can open up Ellipse Path 1. If you right-click or control-click on Ellipse Path 1, we're going to convert it to a Bezier path. Notice now you can open up Path 1 and be able to edit the entire Bezier path. Do make sure that your playhead is still right at the very end of that last up sequence, around 2 seconds and 6 frames. And let's turn on the stopwatch to add a Bezier point starting point for this one. Excuse me, that's a keyframe starting point for this one. Now to animate this, we're going to do it every second frame. So I'm going to hold down the Command key and move forward 2 frames. With our playhead set there, I'm going to double click on my object to make sure that the paths are selected. In this case, we want to select all of our keyframe points. And I'm going to move it down by about half the distance of it, so down about right there. Notice because I had the path selected, it'll add a keyframe. Now, as it moves down, I want it to start to stretch out and also become a little bit more teardrop in shape. So I'm going to carefully select each of the Bezier points that I need to edit. In this case, maybe the bottom one, I'll drag it down. The sides, we'll drag it down. So now it's starting to look like a teardrop. I'll move forward 2 more keyframes. And once again, I'll select everything. Move it down about halfway. And again, select just 1 keyframe at a time. It's going to get much longer. To make it look even more like a teardrop, you can also use your Convert Vertex tool. I'm going to drag these down so that they start to look like this. Again, move forward 2 more keyframes. I'm going to drag my object downward. Do make sure you got all the keyframes selected. There we go. Now we'll move it downward about halfway. Go in just a little bit more for this one. And we'll let this be the final splat. As it moves down. If we want, we can test this out by seeing as it falls down. So that's looking really good. Now once it hits the ground, we need to have it animated, splatting outward and moving outward throughout the along the surface that it's on. To do this, you may also want to add some anchor points. So again, I'm going to move forward 2 frames. Make sure the Bezier points are selected. Oops, there we go. I'm going to start to drag these outward and also make sure this is going down just a little bit. Move forward 2 more. Drag these outward. I'm going to move this down and let it start to flatten out just a little bit. 2 forward more again. Again, bring this down. And for the amount that it goes out, it should also be moving down. So we want to keep that proportional. I'm also going to add some keyframes by using my Add Vertex tool to each side to make this be a little bit easier to work with. Move forward 2 more frames. Use my Selection tool to bring this down. And also move it outward. Start it to get flat. It's going to start to flatten out a lot. Move inward. I think 1 more keyframe to have it kind of come to a resting point where it's nice and in a puddle. Again, move it outward, have it come to a resting point where it's kind of in a puddle from here. Let's back up and test our animation. So far, pretty good. Now when it does this, notice that it's going a little bit slow in splatting out. If that's happening for you, then all we need to do is adjust the timing of it. Notice that we skip forward every 2 frames. So in this case, if I want it to go faster, all I need to do is to start to nudge some of these keyframes in, and I'm going to have my splat happen every first frame. Much better. Let's go a little bit faster on this. The final thing you can do to make it go even faster is to simply remove some of your keyframes and have it jump over those. So for instance, if I don't want this to happen, I'm going to delete away that keyframe. Let's move in my final keyframe. So take some time and adjust the timing for this until you get it the way you want. All right, there we go. So now after it bounces, it splats down and it does it relatively quickly. I'm liking the look of that. With this done, let's add a final embellishment to our animation by adding some shadow and texture to our design. I'm going to twirl close Shape Layer 2. Let's bring our playhead all the way back to our starting point, and we'll work on Shape Layer 1. With the layer selected, go up to Layer, down to Layer Styles, and let's apply a bevel and emboss. This is going to add a little highlight edge as well as a shadow edge to whatever object you've got selected. Now to play around with the settings, you can open up the Layer Styles setting and also swivel open the bevel and emboss settings. There's a bunch of different things we can do to this, but let's make sure our style is set to Inner Bevel. Let's set the size of it to fill out the entire area. So I'm going to fill this all the way up to about, let's go 100 to 250. We can keep it nice and soft at 0. And then finally, we can change the highlight and shadow color. I'm going to set my highlight color to be something in the yellow family. We can keep the blending mode set to screen. I'm going to make it a little bit lighter so I can see it. That looks good. And I'm going to change my shadow color to something in the purple family. To make it show up a little bit better, I'm going to change my shadow mode to color so that it'll colorize what I'm working with. You can also play around with the opacity of each one to make it more or less bright. So I'm going to bring both of those up to 100%. Now we can twirl closed all of the options for Shape Layer 1, and you can see how it applies it to the entire animation. That is, until it turns into the splat version of the ball. So what we need to do now is to copy and paste that over to Shape Layer 2. Open up Shape Layer 1, select the Layer Styles, and Command C to copy it. You can now twirl it closed, select Shape Layer 2, and then Command V to paste that style. Now it's pasted on here, and it'll be applied to its animation as it plays through as well. All right, with this done, we now need to render our final video. Let's go up to File, down to Export, and add it to our render queue. We'll keep our settings to be the best render settings. We'll set our output mode to be a movie file, and let's output it, in my case, to our folder or to our desktop. We're going to call this Bounce Splat. Do make sure you click on the word Render. This will render out your entire movie and save it as a movie file. Upload both the movie file and the After Effects file to our class page.